Hey everybody, how you doing? It's your favorite self-proclaimed master, aka Timalik here, bringing you some more analysis. Today, I'm going to talk about something pretty close to my heart when it comes to chess, and something that a lot of chess players, I think, need to have more of in their repertoire. Now, if you ask me, there's pretty much two kinds of chess players. There's your theory guys and your strategy guys, right? So you've got your theory players who spend a lot of time researching all of the proper lines and knowing the names of all the different play styles and what to do in very specific position. They're book people, you know, they're the more academic chess players. And then you have your strategy guys who typically take a lot longer to learn how to play, but those type of kind of specialized players can typically look at a board and give you an idea of what's going on and not necessarily why. I think to be a truly great chess player, you've got to have both of those abilities, and you've got to kind of balance out either your studying time or your playing time to be able to do both. So I also want to, the title of this video is going to include the Elephant Gambit. This video is not specifically about the Elephant Gambit because it kind of gets away from the game very, very quickly, but this is a game I played on chess.com, rated around 1350 at the time, so I am going up in rating points, which is great. And so this is how the game started. It went e4, excuse me, and then we see e5 back from my opponent, and my favorite style of playing is the Scotch game, is white, and so I figured, great, you know, I can develop my knight to f3, he's going to develop to c6, and then I can play d4, and I'm entirely in my comfort zone. One of the reasons I wanted to show you this game is because I got taken out of my comfort zone very, very quickly, and knowing how to play out of your comfort zone is not an easy thing. So we see knight to f3, and then d5. This confused me. For a lot of reasons. For one, I know if I take the pawn on d5, then maybe the queen captures with plans of going e4 with the pawn to threaten my knight. Or if I capture on d5, maybe the pawn immediately moves to e4, and then when the queen captures the pawn, it's threatening my knight. So right off the bat, I can tell that my opponent is going to grab a tempo. So if we want to look at the actual book lines, which I did after the game, I didn't know them at the time the game was played. The idea is that white is supposed to capture this pawn and accept this little gambit of this guy moving forward, because when the queen moves down and the knight develops to its natural square, you get a tempo on the queen, and white has a massive lead in development. This is the first point that I wanted to talk about. A lot of people kind of shun the theory guys, and they say, oh, what fun is chess if you turn it into a classroom, right? If I would have known the lines for this gambit, I would have not only won the game, but understood why I won the game, and I would have had pretty valuable practice playing against the Elephant Gambit. If you don't understand what's going on in a game, the experience isn't going to teach you anything, because the chances of you getting back to the position that you were in your game are very slim. If you play by the lines, and you play those lines again and again and again, not necessarily always the exact same thing, but close to the same system, you'll start to get an idea of how to play those positions that you end up in when you follow those lines. In this game, I'm not going to be able to take a whole lot away from this as a chess player, because I know that I'm not going to end up in this position again. So this video is to go to show why it's very, very important to know the lines, and thankfully, my opponent didn't know them too well either. I went bishop b5 check. To be entirely honest with you, I didn't have much of a plan. I figured, okay, if I can go bishop to b5 check, my opponent blocks with the light square bishop. So, let's say my opponent blocks with the light square bishop, I capture here, my opponent takes here. At this point, I'm a little bit more comfortable playing something like d3, right? Because after pawn takes here, and here, now my opponent is nearly forced into exchanging queens like this. I don't mind losing the right to castle. And whenever my opponent makes his next move, let's just say it's something like that, I'm not saying that that's a good move or a bad move, it kind of brings me into familiar territory. And I wasn't in familiar territory, and I really, really wanted to be. So that's why we see me doing craziness like that. But that's not what was played in the game. My opponent played c6 and just blocked the bishop. It's kind of disappointing to see something like this as a chess player when you kind of have an idea of how you want a position to play out, and it doesn't work out that way. So now he's kind of blocked the opportunity of the queens coming off the board, and I openly invited him to gain a small advantage in the opening, and he declined. So this started to freak me out a little bit, and I figured, okay, well, I already have 2 pieces developed. My opponent has 3 pawns. I've got these 2 guys here, and my opponent has these 3 pawns. Maybe it's a little bit better to play defensive for now and see what the board looks like once the position opens up. So I played here. Again, at this point, I'm out of theory. I'm not comfortable with this position. I've blocked my d-pawn, so that's not advancing anytime soon. I know that my knight wants to come here, and playing here now just loses. So I'm not really too sure what's going on. It's like a weird kind of Maroczy bind situation if I can play c4, but I don't have the knight to attack either one of these squares, so it becomes a little bit dangerous. Plus, with the pawn already being on d5, we see kind of not so good things happening for white. I've wasted a tempo, I've given up the initiative, and now my opponent could grab a lead in development, I think. He didn't. My opponent decided to take this pawn. I thought that was a bit of an interesting decision, because now I don't have to worry about my d-pawn, and I don't have to worry about my queen. I can just capture with the bishop, and everything is just fine from this position. So I was pretty excited to see that. Let me see if I can find the right place here. Yeah. So the engine marks this move order at an advantage of 1.33 for black, which is pretty substantial. So my opponent played bishop to g4 here, and this was a little bit overly aggressive, but I didn't think that it was really that big of a threat. If we look at the bishop, yeah, it's pinning the knight to the king. Or, I'm sorry, to the queen. And the obvious intention is that my knight can currently come here and capture. If he makes this kind of pinning line, then I can't do that anymore. And so it might be a good way for my opponent to save his pawn, and that way he can kind of see some tension forming in the center of the board later on. And considering that I've had these 2 minor pieces out here that aren't really doing anything, it would be great to create some tension, because my opponent can do it with his pawn, and all I have in the center of the board are pieces. So that would be really, really good for him. I decided to force the trade. I played h3 here. For the reason of bishop takes here, I can recapture with the light square bishop, and then look into queen here, pinning this pawn, and create some tension by moving to d4 and threatening to capture with a really, really well-defended centralized pawn. Not to mention, I haven't dedicated this knight yet, so it still has a lot of squares to move to. I'm just trying to find a way to make my weaknesses in development kind of work out for me a little bit more. And I thought I'd be able to do that with this exchange. So my opponent captured, and I recaptured with the bishop. I was pretty darn happy with this, mostly because, again, if you were to plug this into an engine, now it gives an advantage of 0.39 towards white, at least mine does. So I have got a piece developed. I haven't committed any of these guys yet, but we can see that I'm going to be able to get something going, and what would have normally been my bad bishop in this game has turned into my good bishop. So I retain the bishop pair, my opponent gets a centralized pawn, everything's going good. I have my fair share of the center, I'm pretty happy, and my opponent has 1 center square and occupies 1. So everything's worked out fine. I was really glad to see this position end up in the way that it was. However, this is an unfamiliar position. I don't normally go for a fianchetto line for my light squared bishop. I do it a lot with my dark squared bishop, especially when playing against the Perk or the King's Indian Defense. But with the light squared bishop, especially as white, I don't really go for a fianchetto, so very much out of my element, very much uncomfortable. My opponent played for here with very, very obvious intentions of threatening the light square bishop and then going for this little mating pattern here. So I decided to castle, that way I get an extra defender on the f2 pawn. Plus, if you can castle early, chances are you probably should. I did start to notice, however, that this is starting to look a little bit weak. So if my opponent could maybe bring his bishop to here and then come here to threaten the light square bishop, that might be a better course of action. But since he's already moved this, I might be able to get some play. At least that's what I thought at the time. So my opponent plays his queen out, still going for the same attack on f2. However, now that I've castled, I have this rook here to defend. So I decided to make a critical decision here. And the decision was to ignore the threat, mostly because my opponent hasn't developed his other pieces. He hasn't developed this knight to its natural square. This knight can only come here. He hasn't castled yet, and his rooks aren't in the game. The other pieces are off the board. So, with that being said, I know I have at least one and two, if not 3 or 4 moves until this knight is able to get into a position where it can really assist with the attack. I mean, there's just not a whole lot going on here for black, so I decided that this was a threat worth ignoring. Worst case scenario, bishop takes, rook takes, the queen can't recapture because of the king, and I'm in pretty solid shape. I decided to play knight c3, thinking, well, if I can get my knight over to here, then I have an extra defender on my f2 square. Not to mention, I'm going to be attacking this dark square bishop. So I'm going to have a lot of play with one simple, silly little move that also blockades this pawn from moving forward. So my opponent develops the knight, and it's here that we start to see what some might consider a little bit of a standardized position. Again, the point of this video is kind of to scream, know your lines, you know, and on the same note, be able to play without your lines. You know, it's a very, very delicate equation. And we can see with moves like this that knowing some basic theory goes a long way. Also, knowing basic strategy goes a long way. So deciding to ignore this threat is basic strategy. You know, we understand that there's not going to be a whole lot that my opponent's pieces are capable of doing to checkmate me over here. And we also see that I had no development on any of these squares and that I needed to develop. So, just some basic reasoning, just develop your pieces and get them to this side of the board. Fend off the attack and start an attack of your own. Basic theory, however, here, knowing kind of from doing tactical puzzles and things like that, that this knight's natural square was not necessarily the best square to move to. I know the knight can theoretically come here and here. It also has this square to develop to, but that would be good for me because it drops a pawn. If we look at that really quick, if I just make some BS move like that, if the knight comes here, I capture with the knight, pawn, bishop. Right, and I'm ahead a pawn, and this position looks really, really good for white, because he's not attacking this bishop anytime soon. It blocks the natural square for the knight. The other square for the knight doesn't look too hot. It does a lot for me. So my opponent obviously doesn't want that, but knowing that theory can bring you quite a long ways. I just want to get back to the normal lines here. Here we go. So after my opponent developed his knight, I decided to move my queen to e2, thinking, well, my opponent may want to bring his knight to this square in order to bring my bishop out of its defense. And if that happens, and the knight's the only one defending, then my knight can't pop into that square. So if knight here, and let's say knight here, then I might have something, but I think the reason that I made this move is I just wanted to keep kind of an extra defender here, and I needed to get the queen kind of out and ready to go. Maybe I was thinking of doubling queen and rook. I'm not sure. But I think it was still a pretty decent idea. I'm going to see just quickly here what the engine thought about this queen to e2 move. So it rates it rates white half a point ahead. So the position is still pretty much equal. My opponent played his B knight to d7 here, which was probably an attempt at defending this bishop from the knight coming here. I think that if you're going to make a kind of bold attack by bringing your queen to h4, then you should probably act on that attack a little bit quicker than my opponent's doing. I would have expected a move like knight e4 or knight g4, sacrificing an exchange in order to maybe further develop pieces. You know, for example, maybe if we saw this, if we would have saw knight here and he could somehow force me to capture with the pawn, now you've got this open file for your queen and checkmating's a lot easier. Or maybe even seeing a sacrifice happen here, and then after the rook takes, maybe the queen has some more play. I think normal developing moves are good in normal developing positions. This is not a normal position, so we need to see more action out of black if black's going to stand a chance at making this attack work, because currently I've got first and second defenders here, and third defender, and my opponent just has the two attacking pieces, and he has to attack. So this square is overly defended, and not to mention the move knight e4 threatens this, and defends that. So this is imminent. You'd think we'd see our opponent do something about it, but we haven't. Finally, I played knight e4. I figured now was about the time. I think at the time I was really planning on capturing the knight, but in retrospect that might not have been a good idea, because after the pawn takes, the rook can move to g3 and it creates a whole nother attacking pattern. So I think I'd be pretty happy to take this bishop and capture and take away my opponent's attack, at least for the most part. So either way, I think that this is a solid move. It centralizes the knight. The knight also has this square to move into for check if for some reason the bishop were to move off of this diagonal. There's a lot going on here, and worst case scenario, the knight can even drop back to stop the queen from attacking on f2. It's principal ideas like this. You know, when you hear grandmasters talk about candidate moves and things like that, one of those segments is looking at your opponent's threats, and you've got to kind of understand those before you do much of anything else. If your opponent is threatening mate in 1, it doesn't matter if you can win a queen. Unless that queen is part of your opponent's mate, then you're going to lose the game. You know, this game is not about pieces. It's about the board. It's about your king. So you've really got to kind of see those threats and be able to respond to them. And I think I've responded to this threat well, if not overly well. I've probably missed some attacking opportunities so far by defending too much. However, moves like this that both defend and attack, I just personally think are great. And if we look quickly at knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes, my queen is still on this file to defend. So I've got plenty here, although originally I didn't see that the queen was a major threat. So we see castling, which is okay. I mean, it gets some king safety right away, but it also gives me ideas of taking here so that maybe I can double up these pawns and get my opponent's exposed king. Instead, I decided to take c5. I figured just to be overly sure, I'd rather have this position, because once the knight takes here, the knight's completely contained. It's not coming to this square because of the bishop. It's not coming to this square because of the queen and the pawn. Not coming to this square because of the pawn. And over here, the knight doesn't really do much of anything. And once in this position, the only forward attack he has is on this square, which is defended by the bishop. I know that that looks like some sort of weird stick figure person, and I'm sorry if there's a lot of arrows. I just get overly excited about awesome knight moves. So, the knight capture there takes an attacker off of this square, and also puts his knight into a little bit of a bad position. He recaptures with the knight. At this point, I'm very, very happy with my progress, because I know that this knight's not going to be doing much harm. This knight is mostly contained, and this queen can be attacked. Not to say that I necessarily want to attack the queen anytime soon, but I think at this point I'm probably up material. I'm not sure if there's a way to tell in the analysis. Let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, so the pawns are equal. I've got 2 bishops, he's got 2 knights, 2 rooks, he's got 2 rooks, and my queen. So yeah, I guess I'm not technically up material, But if we look at knight takes c5 here on the analysis, it now puts me 1.13 points ahead. So engines and things tend to recognize positional strengths and weaknesses. So we see queen takes e5 next. Pretty simple decision. After all of those exchanges, I'm finally able to take this undefended pawn and maybe try to start forming some sort of an attack on the king and use these two bishops to my advantage. A lot of grandmasters and things tend to agree that having a bishop pair is better than having a knight pair, simply because in an open board, two bishops can checkmate a king, two knights cannot. So we see the knight come in. This move kind of frightened me a little bit because I knew it would be a little bit of a sorry sight to have to play something like that, because normally when I see moves like this, and again talking about being used to positions, the knight has just captured a pawn on e4. That wasn't the case here. The knight just kind of willingly moved into e4, and obviously this becomes a threat again. So I don't want the threats to happen. I play d3. Again, this threat here, it is worrying, but it is not checkmate. All I need to do is threaten the knight. I don't necessarily need it off of the board yet, and in fact, it's blocking off a powerful file for his queen and taking away a square for his other knight to move. I just don't want it to be as big of a threat. My opponent decided to threaten my queen immediately, and I know I've talked about this in other videos, but if you are going to make a threat, you need to look at the follow-up to that threat. You need to think, oh, I could go rook e8 and threaten his queen. What's he going to do? That's the conversation you should be having with yourself. There's no way any normal person is calculating from all of these squares where my queen is going to move, right, after you threaten it. Okay, you could probably deduce that I'm not going to be moving along the e-file, but apart from that, my queen doesn't make much of a threat. If all you want to do is get out of losing your knight, move your knight. There's no sense in threatening the queen here, and that's why I think that this is a terrible move. So I decided to move the queen to the side of the board, because if he's going to have an attack, I want an attack. And while his attack is on my king, it's not threatening enough to be worrisome, because I know that this isn't going to be mate, and I can get material. And once I have the material on this side of the board, these pawns have dreams of promoting themselves to queens and rooks and knights and bishops. So, we see the rook move down a bit. I think at the time I knew why this move happened. I know it's to prepare to double up the rooks, but I don't know why he didn't come here. I'm sure it was because of maybe a threat like this, but I honestly can't tell you exactly what the idea for this move is. Let's check the engine here. NC to e4. Oh, yeah, the engine is just bashing my opponent for moving his knight into this square to begin with. Let's see here. So I move to queen a5. The engine actually does not like the engine likes queen to d4 better. Mostly because if we take a look and we have our queen on d4, then not only is this pawn threatening the knight, but it is pinned to an undefended queen, so the knight definitely falls in that scenario. That's worth mentioning. So you could say that queen a5 is a little bit of a blunder, but in this position both win, so I wasn't too worried about making that mistake. Okay, so engine rates me, let's see here, 1.83 ahead. So you can see you're kind of slowly starting to increase and improve your position, and that's a good point to make as well. Over the course of chess, you don't need to look for drastic, super cool forks and, you know, skewer lines and all kinds of crazy knight moves. You don't need any of that. You need to slowly improve your position, because if you have the better position, the ending of the game is going to have to be pawn moves, and when those pawns start coming down the board, if you're more solid, you're gonna win. So it's important to have good positioning. Okay, rook e6, we saw that. I decided to take the knight, 3 knights. I love it. I'm all about free knights. Let me just see here really quickly. The engine also does not know why my opponent decided to go rook to e6. I played d takes e4, and the engine rates me a solid 4.5 points ahead there. The knight recaptured, and then I played queen a4, which the engine gave both a question mark and an exclamation point to. Because now it is clear that I am going to be able to capture this knight, and the knight is still pinned to an undefended queen. So all I need to do is move rook to e1, and I should be winning. My opponent plays rook e8, which is a very, very solid move if you ask me. Let's see here. Knight takes e4. Where is that? Oh yeah, queen a4. Yeah, rook e8. Engine has no problems with that. I played bishop to e3. I figured, okay, this dark square bishop has been hanging around long enough. It's time to get it involved in the game. It's time to start defending this a little bit more seriously. And then we can take here, and it's going to be a grand old time. Then my opponent played this move, and at first, I have to admit, I did not understand the threat behind this move. I thought this was silly, and I thought this was losing, because I was just going to take here, and then I was going to play the rook out to here, and then I was going to checkmate my opponent with the back rank mate, which is one of my absolute favorites, because it's the first mate I learned. Admittedly, at the time, I was streaming, and somebody told me at this point, stop playing, start thinking, calculate this, understand what my opponent's threat is. And I felt a little bit ashamed afterwards that I hadn't seen it. The queen can now take this pawn, absolutely for free, because this pawn is pinned to my king. So, after about 15 minutes of sitting there and trying to figure it out, I finally saw the threat and decided that moving my king was a good option. Just, you know, if queen comes here, then the pawn can take it, and this just defends all the threats. My opponent played rook g3, and you guys know that I always go for a worst move of the game, and I believe that this was the worst move of the game. I think it was a desperate sacrifice, but I'm not exactly sure why my opponent would play here. I think the plan was pawn takes, maybe queen takes check, knowing that I can't take it because of the knight. And then what, though? You know, I mean, after king here, or even here, there's just not a whole lot that's going to happen. So I wish I would have known the calculation, but I didn't. Rook g6. That might be later on. Okay. So I took with the pawn, easy peasy. My opponent took with the queen. I figured, okay, that's the end of that threat. And then my opponent did something a little bit wacky. He moved the rook off of the 8th rank. If you're not going to move any pawns in front of your king, that's okay. If you aren't going to move these pawns, like, at all, and maybe a good idea for king safety, but in that case, you really shouldn't leave the 8th rank undefended, because you're going to get back-ranked mate. So, I captured the knight, thinking, okay, well, the knight can pop here now, and maybe that turns into a bigger threat, so I didn't want that to happen. Captured the knight. He took with the queen, my dark square bishop, so I decided to threaten the queen. Queen moves out of the way, and now I am threatening checkmate, because now if my queen moves here, the only legal move is to move his rook here, and then queen takes rook checkmate. So, I was pretty happy about seeing this. Of course, he saw the threat and played the pawn forward. The good thing about this is my opponent has removed his entire diagonal. I don't know why my opponent didn't just play for his pawn here, especially considering I no longer have the dark square bishop. I think that that's a silly idea, but maybe the idea is to push here, knowing that this pawn is pinned, and try to take advantage of that pin. So, I go ahead and took another pawn. If you can take material, and you can take material safely, you should take material, and you should take material safely. I don't think there needs to be a whole lot of explanation there. You guys know what you're doing, you know? If you see free material, and you don't necessarily see mate, go for it. So, my opponent played his queen out, and I think this became a little bit more evident now. His threat of coming here, and then taking here with the pawn, I'm sorry, not the queen, So, my opponent coming here, this can't move. taking here with the pawn, knowing that maybe I have to take here, and then playing, I don't know, something crazy. So, yep, my opponent's going for checkmate. I decided to also go for checkmate. At this point, I am massively ahead in material. I have my bishop, he has no minor pieces. I have 2 rooks, he has 1 rook, and we both have our queens. And I also have an extra pawn. So he has 3 over here, and 1 over here. I have 3 over here and 2 over here. So I guess, more accurately, an extra pawn. Anyway, so I've got an extra pawn going on. I have an extra bishop. I've got an extra rook. At this point, simplify the position. I'm perfectly willing to give away material if it is going to make the position simpler and let me win easier. So my idea is, okay, well, bishop takes here, maybe queen takes, rook takes here, this pawn can't move, and then I have a nice pin. So, or, I'm sorry, the idea was, oh gosh, what's going on? Yeah, bishop takes here, if king takes here, rook takes here, this pawn can't recapture. But if bishop here and queen here, I can still exchange, right? And then if the pawn comes here, I can exchange queens too. So maybe let's play this out. So bishop takes, let's say queen takes. I think that that's a little bit more logical. Rook takes here, pawn takes here, queen takes here, king takes here. And now if we look at the position, I have very, very nice moves, which leave my opponent in an endgame where he has 1 pawn and his king, and I have 3 passed pawns. I think that is why, after bishop takes here, my opponent stopped playing the game, I believe. Yeah, it was here that my opponent resigned. There's no good moves here. Black is going to lose. It's just a matter of how black wants to move. I guess maybe the king could have come here, but then you're just dropping the rook. It just doesn't work in any way. So, yeah. All about knowing your threats, and knowing a little bit of theory and a little bit of strategy can go a long way. If you're a guy that just loves to read chess books all the time, go out of the lines a couple times a week when you're playing. You know, just pick an opening that you know absolutely nothing about, maybe the first 4 moves, and just play it and see what happens. Get yourself familiar with positions. If you're a guy that just plays crazy shit all the time and has no idea what anything is named, but you're pretty good, look into some theory. Look into your favorite opening and learn its name and learn the history. You know, learn what chess player played it the most and why they played it, and maybe even read a book on something or other. If you kind of culture yourself well, you'll start finding positions like this where you'll understand that it's okay to sacrifice the bishop here, while at the same time knowing that this came from the Elephant Gambit and being able to look up the Elephant Gambit after the game and know the moves. So I hope that all of those ideas kind of sink in with you guys, because it's something that I'm trying to get better at myself. And if you guys did enjoy, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It helps me out a lot. I'm also putting a link to my Twitch TV, my little live stream, in the description below, so you guys can check that out if you like. We have a lot of people come in the live stream and watch. I do live 30-minute games and full commentary. It's pretty fun. So anyway, guys, my name's Timalik. I really enjoyed doing this video for you guys, and I hope to see you all next time. See ya.